accosted writer, Leani Lopez. Excited to be back with another episode of I Got Nothing. This week's topic is one that was given to me by a listener, and they wanted to ask for advice on writing their first novel. A little bit of background for myself, if you're just joining us for the first time, and by us I mean me. I have written many novels over the years. I have 2 that are published under my name. However, I am a ghostwriter and have been ghostwriting for the last 4 years. So I have written a lot of novels and have actually learned a lot over my time as a ghostwriter that I have been able to translate into my own writing, into my own process. So when I got this question, I was really excited. Well, I'm excited all the time when it comes to talking about writing. But this one in particular resonated with me because it just made me think of my first novel that I ever wrote and how long it took me to write it and the journey I went through in self-publishing. So I'm going to talk about that. But as usual, if there is a topic you want me to cover or you have a question for me, feel free to shoot me a message. I am on pretty much all social media. You can get in touch with me a bunch of different ways. I have a link tree that has all of my stuff in one location. I will make sure to link it in the description of this episode. But circling back to my first novel. My first novel that I completed and self-published is actually no longer up on Amazon. I self-published it back in 2013, so at the time, self-publishing through Amazon wasn't as sophisticated as it is now. I could only do it as an ebook. I couldn't do it in paperback. But the main reason why it's not available anymore is because it was supposed to be the first book in a trilogy. However, when I finished writing, I never went back to those characters or had the desire to go back to those characters. So we will touch a little on that later because there is an important story and lesson I learned there. But if we're starting at the beginning, I first had, I wouldn't say the idea for this particular book. It was called Blood, and it was part of the Mordia trilogy. And the first draft of the first chapter actually came from my sister. I have an older sister who, at the time, we had very similar writing styles. And she had this idea of a vampire that was raised by witches and wrote a scene about the witches finding the baby in the woods. And I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. And it actually connected to something I had written around the same time. I think I was 17 at this point, 17 or 18. No, it would have been 17 because it was junior year of high school. And I realized I didn't have any creative writing stuff that didn't have to do with school assignments. So one day I sat down and wrote this little short thing, a couple pages long, thinking on the first draft of that. Oh boy. But it was about another vampire who was essentially a vampire prostitute who had a son that she was trying to raise on her own. And when I read what my sister had written and I read what I wrote, there was a little bit of a connection there because we're sisters. And at the time, like I said, we had very similar writing styles. So we decided to collaborate, and that's kind of where it sat for another 3 or 4 years until I was in college. During my college career, I did not write much. I was just working a lot, had a lot of classes, did theater, and there was just zero time for creative writing, which is funny because I was a creative writing major. But by that point, my sister was kind of on a different path than I was, and in talking to her, she said, "You can have the story, I'm not going to finish it." So I was like, okay, cool, I'll finish it. And another year goes by, and it's time for my senior thesis, which, again, creative writing major, so my thesis could be a book. And the best part is I didn't even have to finish it. How awesome! So that's what I worked on. And I worked on that while I was also doing a creative writing workshop, which, if you can ever do a creative writing workshop, I really highly recommend it. I went to a small school, so our upper level classes were pretty small, and we literally just shared what we wrote that week and gave constructive feedback, and it was like the best thing ever. I learned so much. And while I was working on the story, I wrote it in pieces, and I didn't write it in order, which I think is the only story that I did in that way. Mostly because I had no idea what I was doing and I was all over the place. So what I would do is just write down scenes that were in my head and then kind of piece them together like a jigsaw later. But I took that scene that my sister had written, which was a couple pages. It was a pretty good starting point. And so for that particular novel, the first chapter, half was myself writing it and half was my sister. Anything else in the story was mine. And I think that's kind of another reason why I didn't continue it. However, I liked the scene that she wrote, but I felt like it needed a lead up. I felt like we needed to see how we got to that point. And so I edited it and then started writing scenes here and there, piecing them together. I'm pretty sure I did not finish the novel for the thesis, but I did get a good chunk of it done. And it inspired me to keep working on it. So I graduated college in 2011, and the book was self-published in August of 2013. So from the inception of the story all the way to the end of it was a fairly lengthy process. It was such a wonderful feeling of accomplishment when I actually finished a book. And I wrote a book. I was in my early 20s, and when it was self-published, I had just had a baby. I had my son Archer. He was a couple months old at that point. And I managed to finish writing a book while pregnant, while starting a new job, while graduating college, while doing a lot of things. So it took some time. And that is okay. I know a lot of people see people putting out books left and right and writing real fast. And now that I'm older, now that I have done this a lot, and now that I have a process, I write really quickly too. Mostly for ghostwriting because that has to be on a timetable. But when it comes to my own stuff, I tend to write a little slower. And in reality, when I actually buckled down and was like, I want to finish this, I think it took me less than a year to finally, sit down and focus and do it. I think the writing process can be a lengthy one if you're like me and have that imposter syndrome and anxiety, kind of being like, yeah, other people can write books, but you can't write the book. You can write the book. Ignore that voice. That voice is a bitch and she doesn't know what she's talking about. You can write the book. But in the process of doing this, I learned a lot about myself, and I learned a lot about what works for me and what doesn't work for me. And even now, that was, oh my God, almost 10 years now as I stare off into the distance and contemplate time and existence. My writing process has changed since then, and the way my brain works and thinks about things has changed as well, the older I got. And now that I have written many books, it becomes sort of another sense. It becomes instinct at a certain point when you do it enough. And I think that's the key. You have to do it. I know, guys. I know. If you want to write stuff, you have to actually write stuff. And it sucks. If it could just spring from our heads onto the page, that would be ideal. But unfortunately, our technology is not there. And I'm not good at science, so I can't invent it. But it just takes practice. The more you commit yourself to learning and growing, the easier it'll be to a certain point. Writing in general is hard. It's hard. It's hard work. But you can do certain things to make the process easier on yourself. One of the things, I know people talk about it all the time. It was not something I was interested in doing in the beginning, but outlining can help with organizing the craziness that is your mind. And you don't have to do any kind of like deep dive outline. You can literally just do like bullet points per chapter. Not even that, just like bullet points of stuff that you want to hit. But I think one of the main things that I want to share, because it is something that I have to remind myself to remember, is that the written word, not even the written word, stories in general have been around as long as people have been able to talk to each other. And there have been countless stories written by countless writers. But while there have been many stories that have been written, there may not be many stories that have been written by you. Your perspective is different from other people's perspective. That's just how life works. That's just how individualism and willpower and thought and growth and all that stuff works. You're going to think differently than the person who wrote a similar story did. You may have ideas that somebody else has written already. Actually, guaranteed you will have an idea that has been written already. But it's important to remember that it was not written by you. And so your perspective is going to make the difference. So don't get so caught up in, I have to write the story that no one has ever wrote before. Because A, it's not possible. B, that's a lot of pressure to put on yourself. And C, at a certain point, it's an excuse to play things safe. And I know that it's an excuse to play things safe because I use that excuse all the time. So if I use it, chances are you use it too. Another thing to remember, you're going to make mistakes. It's going to happen. You're going to use the wrong word. You're going to spell things wrong. If you're like me and when self-publishing, you're unable to afford an editor or had to do all of that yourself, you're going to miss stuff because you're human and it happens. And our brains read things the way that they are meant to be, not exactly how they are. But it's important to remember that the mistakes are going to happen. As long as you acknowledge them, fix it, move forward. And if you can't fix it, just keep it in your mind for the future. You're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. It's going to happen. And it's going to suck when it does. But at a certain point, when you make another mistake, you're just going to be like, okay, and then move on. I had that when I was redoing Slip of the Hand because I had self-published that a couple of years ago. And then last year, actually not last year, at this point, December 2021, I had decided I wanted to re-release it and went through and edited it a little bit more formatting-wise because I knew more and I had fresh eyes on it. I still made mistakes. The back cover for the first couple of books that were printed, there's full-on grammatical mistakes in the bio because I didn't catch it. And the artwork wasn't centered properly. So the first couple of books don't look very good. But I fixed it. I didn't freak out. And I kept going. I also chose a photo for the cover where the male does not look like the description in the book. And my mom pointed it out. And I laughed and I was like, oh well. And that was pretty freeing that I didn't feel the need to go back and edit the whole book so that he had dark hair. I was like, Leani, that's not feasible. You don't have time for that. Not many people, if anyone, are going to care or notice. But it made me laugh, and it still makes me chuckle to think about, which is great. I would also say, in terms of advice for a first novel, if I could go back and talk to myself, which is, those scenarios we always think, I would probably warn myself not to create a novel that is the first in a series or the first in a trilogy, because again, that put a lot of pressure on me for that one book, because that first book is setting up a world, setting up a universe, setting up characters that you are going to revisit time and time again. And I've learned over the years, just by ghostwriting and also writing fan fiction, that I don't really like doing sequels. There's a certain point when I finish a story where I'm like, I'm not ready to let these characters go. I gotta keep the story going. I can't let them go. And then I'll get like a couple chapters into a sequel, and then I'm like, actually, you know what? I think I'm ready to let them go. So that knee-jerk reaction of being like, wait, I'm not done with these characters yet. It's going to happen because you put so much of yourself into them, and you're sad to see them go, especially when it's been years that you've been working on something. So I think I would tell past Leani to write a standalone first. And once I got into the groove of writing novels, and once I got an idea that was a little bit bigger than that, then I could explore doing a series or trilogy. My dad still talks about that first book. Love you, Dad, if you're listening. He really loved that first book, and he does the dad thing of being like, it would be a really good Netflix series. And he was actually really upset when I took the book down. He was like, where's your book? And I was like, I'm not going to keep it up there because I'm not going to finish it. And I don't want to have the first book in a trilogy that's never going to be complete. And I think the reason why I didn't feel like continuing it was because I was so young when I wrote it. And part of it wasn't my own idea. My sister started the witches side of things. I did the vampire side of things. And while I did have notes and a couple chapters written for the follow-up, there was a certain point where I was like, I don't want to write these characters anymore. I want to move on to something else. And if you read that first book, it's a pretty cohesive story. I'm pretty proud of it, especially since I actually finished it. But I moved on. I moved on to different genres. I was heavy into fantasy at that point. And right now, when writing, I don't really write fantasy all that much. Unless it's fan fiction, and that's because I don't have to create the world. I'm not a big world-building person. That's another thing I learned about myself when writing a book. And a fantasy one to begin with. If you love world-building, if that's like your bread and butter, then ignore what I just said and just go for it. Just build that world and you do you. But I had to learn to appreciate world-building. And even now I'm like, okay, I gotta build this. And it's not necessarily my favorite thing to do. So doing, romance fiction in modern fiction means I don't have to create a world. I can just use the world around us. And it's actually probably one of the reasons why I have put off an audio drama idea that I have been trying to revisit, because that's going to require a lot of world building. But I find I'm in a good place now for that. I've played D&D or Dungeons and Dragons for the last 3 years, and I've run many games which requires world building, so I've learned to love it a little bit, but I don't like it. And I only do it if I have to. So try not to put so much pressure on yourself, I guess, is what that boils down to. If you have an idea and you want this big sweeping epic and you love world building, great, go for it. But if you're like me and world building isn't your favorite thing to do, then maybe writing something that's standalone is the best way to start. And you can build up to that eventually. The novel I'm working on right now for myself, outside of ghostwriting, is what I hope to be the first in a series. But the series isn't going to follow that main character all the time. It's going to follow some of the side characters. So this particular story is taking me longer because I am setting up a world. But once I set up the world, I have it set and I can just play with the characters I create. So I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that it will be a series that I eventually continue. The series itself would be called Voices on the Sea, and it would be a pirate historical romance adventure. But even if I don't decide to continue the series, That first book, I'm hoping to work as a standalone. And I think that's the way it's going to be for me moving forward. Is that, yes, they're a series. Yes, some characters show up in other books, but each book I would like to stand on its own. Less pressure on me, less pressure on readers to have to read the entire series to know what's going on. They'll be able to pick and choose which in the series they want, because hopefully each book is going to be a different subgenre. See, it's a big thing. It's a whole, like, I feel like Charlie Day in front of all those papers and strings just trying to point out where everything is. Again, if anybody says that writing is easy, they don't know what they're talking about. It's crazy. This has to come out of my brain. And it has to come out of your brain, so be nice to your brain. Don't put too much pressure on yourself. Remember that you're going to make mistakes. If you are looking to self-publish, I can give you some information about that and some tips on that. I will say I haven't gone the traditional publishing route yet, so I can't speak to that. And I can't say, oh, self-publishing's better. Like, I don't know. But from my point of view, if you are thinking of self-publishing, remember that's going to be a lot of work, not just on the book, but once the book is done. Just, editing, cover design, and marketing. Marketing is a huge thing that you have to keep in your mind. How are you going to market this? Is there a market for this book? Not that I'm saying you should trim down your idea so it's more marketable. Write what you want to write, but it is something you have to keep in mind and something you have to think about for the future. So if you are looking to self-publish, know that when the book is out, your job is not done. I think that's another piece of advice I would tell younger me, is that you're still going to have to do a lot of work afterwards. And it's going to be worth it. I mean, last year, Lost in the Dark was my first official book release where I had a plan. I didn't just put it out there and be like, hey, it's done, it's here it is. I had an Instagram at that point, so I was doing posts leading up to it. I was doing giveaways. I was really pushing it. And I'm really glad I did. And I'm really glad I had that knowledge that was going to be a thing, because I was able to plan for that. And it's getting, a steady stream of reviews on Goodreads and ratings and things like that, where Slip of the Hand isn't getting much. And I honestly believe it's because I had an actual marketing plan for Lost in the Dark before it came out. That being said, circling back to advice for the first novel in general, all of those things I just said, but most importantly, have fun. Don't put pressure on yourself to be perfect. You can't achieve perfection. One of the things I'm trying to do with my internal voice and combating imposter syndrome is something a good friend of mine asked me, and that is, think of the way you are talking to yourself in your head and ask if you would talk to your child or younger sibling that way, or younger self that way. And if the answer is no, you gotta try and change that narrative. First things first, you can write this novel. You can write this novel. You don't have to do it quickly. You don't have to do it by a certain time, usually. But just remember, you can do this. Think of it this way. Have the confidence of a mediocre white man, and you'll be fine. There are so many mediocre people in general that do a lot of popular things, and pretty sure half of them don't struggle with that imposter syndrome. They just do it because they think they're the best at it. So if they can do it, you can definitely do it. I believe in you, and you should believe in yourself. You got this. Write the story. People are going to read it. And I don't want to say don't even think about not having readers, because that's very much a part of it. You want to share these stories with people. But write for yourself, and honestly, write for your friends. That's a big part of my writing process is talking to my friends. I will talk at them about my writing. Sometimes I'll even be like, hey, I wrote this chapter. Do you want to read it? And they're like, yeah. And I've had friends be my motivation to actually finish a story. I think that's why I finish more fan fiction than I have my own original books. Because I have readers who are like, hey, finish this fucking story. I want to read the next part. So if it helps, see if there's a close friend who is willing to listen. Shout out to my bestie Reagan, who has been reading my stuff for years and is always the one who I'm like, hey. She was actually the editor for Slip of the Hand and Lost in the Dark when they originally were fanfics, which was something else I did. I took a fan fiction that I had wrote that had nothing to do with the world that I was writing it in, and I adapted it into its own story. That's cool too. It's been done many times before. I won't name the actual book series, but we all know which one I'm talking about. And if that got published, you're gonna be fine. You got this. All right, so that wraps up another episode of I Got Nothing, a podcast for exhausted writers. As usual, you can find me on Instagram, Facebook. I have a Twitter, but I don't use it. I am on Tumblr. You can find my fanfic Tumblr, which is @LadyFog. For everything else, I will put a link in the description. And if you have a topic or question, send it my way. I'd be happy to answer it in future episodes. Thanks, guys. Talk to you soon.